The airfield was alive that morning. Flags rippled in the summer wind. Vendors shouted over the hum of engines, and children tugged on their parents' hands, waving tiny plastic jets above their heads. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, a spectacle of thunder and precision. The Great Fairford Air Show. Families gathered in neat rows behind barricades, officials under white tents, veterans seated proudly in their reserve section. The announcer's voice crackled across the loudspeakers, rehearsed and sharp. Cameras were ready. Nothing seemed out of place, except for him. At the far edge of the tarmac, where the crowd thinned and the chatter faded into the distance, a single man sat alone. He wore an old blue windbreaker, faded by time and sun, with a patch sewn onto the chest that only a few still recognized. His chair was no grand seat, just a folded canvas, one he had carried in himself. No family at his side, no camera in hand, no VIP badge dangling around his neck. Just him, the chair, and the sky. When he had first arrived, he'd walked slowly, carefully, as though his legs carried not just age, but decades of memory. At the gate, he'd asked softly, "Where's the veteran section?" The volunteer glanced at her clipboard, her voice polite but firm. "I'm sorry, sir. Those seats are reserved for pre-registered guests." He hadn't argued. He hadn't explained. He simply nodded, whispered thank you, and walked on until he reached the fence at the eastern perimeter, where the runway stretched endlessly toward the horizon. There he unfolded his chair and sat down, hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes locked on the open sky. For an hour, he barely moved. Jets screamed overhead, shaking the ground beneath the crowd, but he didn't raise a phone or cheer. His eyes followed each plane with the stillness of someone who had seen it all before, not from the safety of an air show, but from places where each roar of an engine carried life and death with it. Most people ignored him. Some assumed he was just another enthusiast who couldn't get a ticket close enough to the action. But not everyone passed him by. A boy, maybe 12, wandered too far from his father and stopped in front of the man. He looked at the faded jacket, at the patch sewn crookedly onto the chest, and asked, in a voice loud enough for nearby heads to turn, "Were you in the Air Force?" The old man's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. His voice was soft, steady. "A long time ago." The boy's eyes widened. "Did you fly jets?" The man turned his gaze back to the sky. His answer came after a pause, almost like a secret being shared. "No. I watched them leave, and waited for them to come back." Before the boy could ask anything more, his father hurried over, calling him back with an embarrassed smile. The boy obeyed, but not without one last curious glance at the man in the chair. The moment passed. Yet, for those who noticed it, the silence it left behind was heavier than the roar of any jet. Somewhere near the operations tent, Captain Daniel Hayes, a junior officer responsible for the day's coordination, lowered his binoculars. He had caught the exchange, and though he tried to shake it off as a sweet, forgettable moment, something about the man wouldn't leave his mind. The posture, the stillness, the angle of his cap. Hayes didn't know it yet, but this stranger was no ordinary spectator. And before the day was over, every soul on that airfield would know it too. But who was he? And why did he sit so quietly, so far from the seats reserved for men like him? The answer waited in the sky. Captain Daniel Hayes had a checklist in his hand, but his eyes kept straying to the east fence. The crowd was swelling now. Families settled into rows of folding chairs. Vendors passed out cold drinks, and officers in crisp uniforms straightened ties under the weight of the midday sun. Everything ran on schedule. Everything except the gnawing thought in Hayes's chest. The man in the chair hadn't moved. Not once. Hayes told himself it was nothing. Just an old man who liked planes. He'd seen dozens like him at air shows. Retired mechanics, hobbyists, men who'd worn the uniform briefly and held on to it for decades afterward. But there was something different about this one. It wasn't just the jacket, though it was old. Far older than anything the souvenir stalls would sell. It was the way he sat, straight-backed, hands folded, not a casual observer, but someone waiting for something. Hayes adjusted the focus on his binoculars, zooming in across the shimmering tarmac. That's when he saw it. Not the large patch, the obvious one. That was easy to dismiss. But tucked against the seam, barely visible under the windbreaker, was a smaller insignia. Hayes's breath caught. He zoomed in further, his pulse quickening. Combat Controller. There weren't many left who wore that badge. Fewer still from the era that jacket belonged to. Hayes lowered the binoculars, his thoughts racing. Combat Controllers weren't just another unit. They were the unseen hands, the ones who called down thunder in places no one dared to speak of. Men who disappeared into jungles and deserts, guiding planes that others never saw. Why would someone like that be sitting alone at the fence line, unrecognized, unannounced? Hayes slipped into the operations tent, where radios buzzed and young officers scurried with clipboards. He found a moment between calls, logged into the security feed, and pulled up the east perimeter camera. The image wasn't sharp, but it was enough. He froze the frame, enhanced it as much as the grain would allow. The badge was real. The insignia was no replica. And there, faint, nearly erased by time, another mark on the shoulder. The Strategic Air Command. Hayes felt his chest tighten. That command had been dissolved decades ago. Only men who'd walked through fire carried those emblems anymore. He tapped quickly on his tablet, pulling up the veterans' archive. Names scrolled past. Eras. Squadrons. Decorations. Until one stopped him cold. Lieutenant Colonel James R. Callahan. Combat Controller. Strategic Air Command. Vietnam. Laos. Cambodia. Reported missing for 6 days after a covert nighttime extraction under enemy fire. Later awarded the Air Force Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, for saving the crew of a downed Phantom jet without air support. The record ended with one final line. Declined public ceremonies. Never gave interviews. Retired quietly in 1981. Hayes swallowed hard, staring at the tablet. Could it be? Could that man at the fence really be Callahan? He looked back up from the screen. The man was still there, unmoving, his face calm, almost unreadable. To the crowd, he was invisible. Just another shadow on the edge of the field. But to Hayes, his presence was beginning to feel like gravity. A young protocol officer approached. "Captain, sir, are you all right?" Hayes hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I need a second set of eyes on the man at the eastern fence line. Don't approach him. Just confirm." The officer frowned. "Sir, he's not on the list." "I know," Hayes said, his tone quiet but firm. "That's why I'm asking." The officer nodded and left, still puzzled. Hayes exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. Around him, radios chattered, schedules tightened. The announcer's voice filled the field. But for Hayes, everything else seemed distant. Because if his suspicion was right, if the man really was who he thought he was, then no checklist, no protocol, no pre-approved flight plan could contain what was about to happen. And soon, the sky itself would bear witness. The airfield pulsed with anticipation. A marching band's medley spilled from the loudspeakers. Children climbed onto their parents' shoulders, waving flags, as if their tiny arms could reach the jets that waited silently at the far end of the runway. Cameras glimmered like 100 restless eyes. Everything was ready. Everything rehearsed. But not everything would go as planned. Captain Hayes stood just outside the operations tent, his checklist forgotten in his hands. His gaze kept drifting east, toward that solitary figure by the fence, the man who had barely moved in 2 hours. Hayes had seen the records. He knew the name. If his instincts were right, that man wasn't just a spectator. He was a ghost from the archives, a legend who had saved lives yet chosen to vanish into silence. Beside Hayes, Captain Morgan, leader of the F-22 demonstration team, adjusted his flight suit. He caught Hayes's troubled look. "You seem distracted, Danny," Morgan said, half smiling. "Don't tell me the checklist got you spooked." Hayes hesitated, then tapped his tablet. He turned the screen toward Morgan. Morgan read the file quietly, lips pressed tight. At the bottom, his brow furrowed. "No way. That man's here? Sitting out there like nobody knows his name." Hayes nodded slowly. Morgan's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the jets gleaming under the sun. If it's him, he shouldn't be watching from the fence. Hayes's voice was low. "What would you do?" Morgan didn't answer right away. He looked back at the old man, who hadn't budged, who sat with the calm stillness of someone waiting for a sign. Finally, Morgan said softly, "Sometimes you don't ask permission. You just know." The announcer's voice boomed across the airfield, sharp and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, please turn your eyes to the sky. The United States Air Force F-22 Raptor demonstration team is ready for launch." The crowd erupted in cheers. 1,000 phones lifted toward the heavens. Engines roared to life. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt deep in the chest, rattling bones and shaking the ground itself. One by one, the Raptors thundered forward, sleek silver predators rising from the earth as if pulled by invisible strings. The diamond formation cut through the blue with mathematical precision. They rolled, banked, and dove in unison, their thunder echoing across the field. Each maneuver was perfect, a testament to endless hours of practice. The announcer narrated every twist with rehearsed excitement. The crowd gasped, clapped, roared. But Hayes wasn't watching the formations. His eyes were fixed on the man by the fence, still straight-backed, still motionless, still waiting. And then it happened. As the jets lined up for their signature maneuver, the 4-point peel, something shifted. Raptor 1 broke formation. It was subtle at first, barely a tilt, just a fraction off angle. But Hayes saw it immediately. His chest tightened. On the ground, the announcer's voice faltered. Ladies and gentlemen, you may notice a slight adjustment from a team." The other jets held their path, executing the practiced routine. But Raptor 1, Captain Morgan's jet, dipped low, lower than protocol allowed. The nose tilted, the wings leveled, and instead of climbing back into the diamond, the aircraft banked wide and set a direct course for the eastern perimeter. Straight for the man in the chair. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Cameras swung. Voices rose in surprise, not fear, because this wasn't aggression. It was deliberate, reverent. The Raptor came in low. So low the air shimmered above the fence line. So low you could see sunlight gleam off its canopy. And as it passed, silent and steady, its wings tilted in a gesture no announcer could name, no manual had written. Below, the man finally moved. He raised one hand, pressed it gently to his chest. No salute, no spectacle, just a quiet hand over a quiet heart. The jet roared past with restrained grace, climbing into the sun, vanishing like a shadow swallowed by light. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in silence. A silence heavier than sound. Officers removed their caps. Honor guards turned east and stood at attention. Parents hushed their children, unsure what they had just witnessed. Hayes's throat tightened. He whispered to himself, almost trembling, a recognition pass for a ghost. And at the fence, the man sat still, one hand pressed over his heart, as if time itself had finally paused for him. But when he stood, what would he leave behind? The Raptor had vanished into the sun, yet no one moved. Thousands of eyes stayed fixed on the eastern fence, where a lone man sat in his chair, one hand pressed gently against his chest. It was as if the roar of engines had pulled something hidden into the open, and now the entire airfield held its breath. The announcer's microphone crackled. For once, he had no script, no words. The band was silent. Even the children hushed, sensing instinctively that they had seen something that wasn't part of the show. Across the field, officers removed their caps. A junior airman's hand trembled as he saluted. Within moments, the honor guard turned east in unison, their rifles gleaming as they stood at attention. And still, the old man did not move. He sat perfectly straight, legs crossed at the ankle, eyes lifted to the empty sky where the jet had disappeared. Then, with slow precision, he lowered his hand. His chest rose once with a heavy breath, then fell. Silence pressed in, until finally he reached for the chair. The canvas folded with a faint snap, a sound so small, yet in that suspended moment, it seemed to echo across the tarmac. He clipped it neatly to the small bag slung over his shoulder, then rose to his feet. His legs were stiff, but his posture was unbroken. and he began to walk. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady, deliberate steps, the kind of walk that belonged to a man who had carried far heavier things in silence. The crowd parted instinctively. Cadets stepped aside without command. A young officer stiffened to salute, his hand shaking so badly it barely held. The old man didn't return the gesture, not out of disrespect, but because some salutes are heavier when left unanswered. Near the operations tent, Captain Hayes stood frozen, his chest tight. As the man approached, their eyes met. For a heartbeat, it felt like time folded, the past colliding with the present. Hayes's throat ached with words he wanted to say but didn't. The old man paused. Just for a moment. He gave Hayes the smallest of nods, not recognition, not thanks, but something deeper. Then he walked on. No one called his name. No one stopped him. And in that silence, respect grew louder than applause. At the far edge of the tarmac, a base shuttle idled, waiting to ferry staff back toward the barracks. The driver blinked in surprise as the old man climbed aboard. He took a seat at the back, his gaze fixed out the window, watching the airfield shrink as the bus pulled away. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. But behind him, it began. One pair of hands clapping. Soft. Hesitant. Then another joined. Then another. Until the sound swelled like a ripple rolling through the crowd. Not the thunder of a stadium. Not the forced cheer of a performance. But a quiet, rising applause. Not for the Raptors. Not for the show. For him. For the man who had asked for nothing, and in return, had been given the only recognition he would accept, a moment of silence, a tilt of wings, and the respect of everyone who saw him. Back on the runway, the Raptors touched down in flawless sequence. Captain Morgan climbed from his cockpit, helmet tucked under his arm. He walked past the control tent, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he reached into his flight vest. He pulled out a patch, old, frayed, weathered by years. He pressed it into Hayes's palm. He flew with my father, Morgan said softly. Saved his squad. No one ever told that story. Hayes looked at the patch in his hand, a relic of battles whispered in shadows, and he knew what it meant. The bus carrying the old man was already gone, but the weight of his presence lingered, as though the air itself still carried him. And from that day, Fairford would never be the same again. Fairford was never the same. In the official records, the Raptors' flight log showed nothing unusual. The paperwork called it a minor deviation. No complaints were filed. No reprimands were issued. On paper, it was just another perfect demonstration. But everyone who had been there knew better. They had witnessed something unscripted, something sacred. The following year on Memorial Day, a folding chair appeared at the far eastern edge of the tarmac. Not in the VIP rows. Not under a tent. Just there, by the fence line, facing the endless sky. On the chair lay a flag, draped carefully, like it belonged there. And resting on top of the flag, a single patch. The insignia of a combat controller. Beside it, a handwritten note, reserved for the ones who never asked. No announcer mentioned it. No brochure explained it. Yet cadets whispered the story to one another, passing it down like folklore. Some called it a myth. Some swore it was true. But every year, when the Raptors roared into the sky, they adjusted their path just slightly. One pass always dipped low, wings leveled, nose tilted, a quiet recognition for the chair at the fence. No one spoke of it officially. But those who knew, those who had seen never missed it. In time, the story spread through the ranks. Pilots told it over late-night coffee. Cadets repeated it in hushed tones, as if saying the man's name too loudly might disturb the reverence of it all. They never wrote his name on a program. They never etched it onto a plaque, because he wouldn't have wanted that. His legacy was quieter, stronger, a tradition carved not in stone, but in silence. A salute not for medals, but for the men who returned with nothing but their memories, and for those who didn't return at all. Sometimes, visitors to Fairford notice the chair. They take photos, puzzled, wondering what it means. Most don't understand. Some ask. Few are told. But every once in a while, Someone in the crowd will notice the slight dip of the Raptors as they pass overhead. If you blink, you'll miss it. If you know, you'll never forget it. And so, the man who sat quietly at the fence, who never asked for honor, became part of something larger than recognition. He became legend. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone like him? Someone who carried the weight of untold stories, who asked for nothing, yet left behind a silence more powerful than applause? If you have, write their name in the comments below. Because this story isn't just about one man. It's about every soul who lived in shadows, gave more than they received, and walked away without asking for thanks. And maybe, just maybe, it's time their silence was heard.